Now it's time for today's perspective on the programme. And depending how you think of it, it is 1 year since Joe Biden was voted in as the next president of the United States. 1 year then since Donald Trump was voted out. And since the vote and Biden taking power a few months later, US politics has been, many might agree, a little quieter perhaps, but still many big issues. Moments have been and gone, not least the messy US withdrawal from Afghanistan, and more recently signs of weakness in Democrat support, but also the eventual passing just this weekend of Biden's infrastructure bill through the House of Representatives. Well, let's discuss all that. And joining me now is Thomas Gift. He's lecturer in political science at UCL, founding director of the Centre on US Politics. Thanks very much for joining us on the programme today. I wanted to start off by talking a little bit about personality. I mean, few would disagree perhaps that it has been a little bit quieter. Gone are those sort of daily, many people would say outrageous tweets from Donald Trump. I mean, it's certainly put a different perspective, if you like, hasn't it, on the presidency?
Well, certainly. And healing America's political divides and bringing the country back to some degree of normalcy were certainly the top priorities that Biden pledged to focus on during the 2020 election and at his inauguration. Although Biden, I think, has largely delivered on bringing back a semblance of normal politics to Washington, he hasn't been able to attenuate the extreme levels of polarization that continue to characterize the American electorate. A study just released from USC's Annenberg School showed data indicating that the political divide in America remains extremely wide still under Biden, especially on issues that you'd expect: immigration, policing policy, racial equity, guns, voting integrity, and COVID-19. I think that that's not too surprising. Polarization that defines American politics is so deeply embedded into the nation's social fabric that it strikes me as almost impossible for one president to make significant progress in reducing during the relatively limited time frame that Biden has been in office. But certainly the tone of the White House, the kind of rhetoric that we hear from the bully pulpit is kind of a 180 from what we saw under Donald Trump, and that's not unexpected. We are back to some degree of normal politics in D.C.
Limited time in there, you said, of course, but I mean, it's a very limited time now, isn't it, till those midterm elections in a year? I mean, there are some worrying signs, aren't there, for Joe Biden and his team?
Well, absolutely. And if you just look at polling recently, it suggests that Biden isn't doing very well. I mean, he had a 38% approval rating, according to a recent USA Today poll. There's no doubt that Biden, however, got a major boost last week with the passage of his infrastructure bill, $1.2 trillion devoted to major projects that America needs in roads, bridges, tunnels, public transport, broadband, clean water, ports, et cetera. All of that is extremely positive for Biden, and I think he will get a boost there. But what we saw just recently was a pretty significant loss for Democrats in the Virginia gubernatorial election. A lot of experts were essentially saying that constituted a reflection of how the American electorate writ large was feeling about Joe Biden. That combined with significant tensions within the Democratic Party, and I think Joe Biden's position politically is still fairly precarious at the moment.
Why is that then? What's he actually doing wrong, do you think?
Well, I think part of it is a huge divide within the Democratic Party. I mean, the Democratic Party is extremely divided. That much is clear. And I think there's real concerns to some extent that Biden has tacked too far to the left in trying to appease progressives. Representative Abigail Spanberger, who's a Democrat, noted just recently that nobody elected Joe Biden to be FDR. They elected him to be normal and to stop the chaos. And I think that has considerable merits to it. Right out of the gates, after Democrats won 2 runoff elections in Georgia and gained control of both chambers of Congress, you really did see a fairly significant pivot by Biden, where he saw a window, maybe not just to be a placeholder president, but to be a transformative one. And between the COVID relief bill, the infrastructure bill, and now this Build Back Better bill that he's going to try to get through Congress, that amounted to roughly $6 trillion in new federal spending. That amount is astronomical, and I think that it created some pushback among moderates, even as progressives kind of asked for more and more and more and more. And so a lot of the challenges that Joe Biden has encountered hasn't just been between Democrats and Republicans, but it's been between members of his own party. He's really had a tough time getting the entire Democratic Party on the same page with some of these big signature initiatives that he's trying to get through.
One key phrase you said there, you said stop the chaos. That may have been at home, but many would argue that the biggest chaos has been the failure, many would argue, again, over Afghanistan. I mean, that's weighing on him still and presumably will continue to weigh on him, would you say?
I think that it will be one of many issues as we head into 2022. I mean, this is something that Joe Biden has continued to defend. And I think by and large, the decision to get out of Afghanistan does have broad support in the United States. A majority did want to see an end to the 20-year war in Afghanistan. But of course, the way that it was done really botched. Has taken a toll on Biden's administration. It has undermined, faith, I think, with some allies in the West, including in France, including in Germany, including in the UK, where there was a lot of pushback, especially in the early going of that withdrawal when we saw how poorly things were going. So that's going to be an issue that that Republicans are going to make salient in 2022. And then again, I think in 2024, whoever the Republican challenger ends up being, you can believe that that issue is going to be back on the table.
And of course, there's been more pushback from France as well after the Asia-Pacific Security Pact, resulting in the huge loss of that submarine contract here in France. I mean, that may, of course, not have that much to do with public opinion in the US, but it's still another indication, perhaps, of Joe Biden not exactly getting on with his neighbours and former allies of the US that he might want to try and get on with.
Exactly. I mean, Biden eventually called that episode clumsy and chalked it up to a miscommunication. That's probably as close as you're going to get to an apology. I'm sure that Macron probably still has some other choice words he used to describe that controversy. But, ultimately, I don't think that's going to be a major issue for Biden domestically. But you're right, to the extent that that undermines faith and trust in America's allies, and it leads some of the traditional partnerships to have a degree of skepticism about whether the United States is always going to do what it sees as being its own interest rather than that of the global community. I think it is a problem for Biden going forward.
And how do you think the Republicans are viewing what's happened over the last year? I mean, presumably it depends whether you're a Donald Trump Republican or a non-Donald Trump Republican.
Well, I think that's right. And there's just like there's a split within the Democratic Party, there's a split within the Republican Party. I mean, by and large, Republicans have remained fairly united, I think, in opposition to Joe Biden's domestic agenda. We did see, though, interestingly, in the infrastructure bill, a number of Republican Congress members, 13, kind of rescue that bill. It wasn't ultimately progressive Democrats who voted for it, at least not all of them, but it was Republicans who got that over the finish line. But I think, Republicans have to be somewhat encouraged with where they are right now. Again, pointing to the Virginia elections that we just saw, that was a big win for Republicans. I think there is going to be a question, though, going into 2022 about how much Republicans should be running kind of on a Trumpian platform versus a more moderate one, if there's any way that they can kind of thread the needle without alienating MAGA supporters, but also appealing to kind of moderate voters, individuals in the suburbs, and so on. And so I think 2022 is going to be a competitive election, but certainly Republicans have to like their chances right now of potentially taking back both the House as well as the Senate.
Thomas, thanks very much. Thomas Gift talking to us there from political science, lecturer in political science at UCL and founding director of the Centre on US Politics. Thanks for joining us on the programme today.
Thank you.
You're watching Live from Paris.